Yeah.
I can fully support your idea of doing some publishing in order to get publishing, so get published. So about for 6 years here in St. Louis, I was involved with my friend Tony Renner in running a poetry reading series called Chance Operations. So that was a method of enabling people to publish by reading their work rather than printing it, right? But it's the best thing I've ever done for my own poetry because I had something to trade. And that's how people approach me, you know. It's like, I've got a reading in a couple of months, then we'd like you to have you, and then, and then and the implicit thing is like, I'd like to read it, you're reading this one.
And you're also always hearing voices, right? Because they're reading. And I think it's important to try to read well, whatever that means to you. You know, the most disappointing reading I ever went to in my life was by a very famous poet named Elizabeth Bishop. This was late in her life. I was a freshman in college, and I thought everyone should be Dylan Thomas, right? Rage, rage, you know. And in shuffles this old woman, and she reads as if it's like the not a very interesting section of the daily newspaper, reading her poems. And I was just, Later I realized that kind of fit her poems, but I remember the disappointment. So read your work appropriately to what the work is, but do try to engage your audience while you're reading. But yeah, that's a different form of publication, is curating a reading series. You can usually get a bar or a restaurant to say you can come once a month, and we'll make a lot of noise while you read. That's one of my issues with readings. But it's really good, and it's a social. So it's you're getting to know people and talk to them about what you love to do.
And taking your work to a reading and reading it there is the public version of talking to your plants that you talked about, right? Because it's an opportunity to say your work out loud and see.
But to people, not plants.
To people, that's right, and to see what works. What do they laugh at? What don't they laugh at?
Yeah, but then don't get seduced, right? Because if no, I'm just saying, it's wonderful when people laugh or they react, but don't get into writing so that that's all you're getting, right?
No, more what I mean is you'll hear when if your rhymes are working, if you're using rhyme, you'll figure out whether you're trying to explain too much before you read your poem, which is a horrible thing people do. Some people, even the introduction is more interesting than the thing they then end up reading, which is really a problem. You find out these things by doing that.
And there's also an interesting cultural element to that too, right? So I live in Hawaii, and I am not a local person, right? So I did not grow up with the customs of Hawaii. And especially when I was first reading, it was just like no one reacted at all. But if someone who was writing in Hawaiian Creole English or Pidgin and was writing about school days, right? And was writing really well and was reading it out loud, and there hadn't been that before, oh my God, there'd be like 500 people there and they'd just be like at the front of their chairs. So, and then sometimes writers, like I can think of Barbara Jane Reyes as a poet that I published, who most of her poems are, in English, and most of us can understand it, but she also will put in stretches of Tagalog or another language that isn't even used anymore in the Philippines. And so you go to a reading and she reads that and you don't understand it and you feel a little left out. And then you realize, well, that's kind of the point, that we don't all have this experience, and many of us, who look like me, come to this thinking we're the audience, when in fact many of us are not. So that's another thing that you can be aware of, is that you can actually be, if not hostile to your audience, you can certainly leave parts of the audience out, and that can be part of what you're doing. So, yeah.
burning question?
Yeah.
If a piece is published, does that mean that always it's also, I mean, a good piece? Because let's say there's a piece presented in a few places that was published, which I didn't think it was, I don't think it's that good, but there's a piece which I think the language is more poetic and it's a really good piece to me. But I sent it to
Well,
9 places and none of them published.
okay, on the positive side of that question about are things good if they're published?
Yeah.
On the positive side, as a publisher, right, I've got a particular thing that I'm looking for, which I call experimental poetry from the Pacific. If someone sends me something that I think is still a little rough, but it really fits this argument I'm trying to make, I might work with that person, or I might even publish it before it's a perfect craft. Someone might send me something absolutely stunningly gorgeous, but it came from Cincinnati, Ohio, and I publish Pacific authors. So I'm going to say no. When Cincinnati finds itself in the Pacific Rim, send it back to me. But until then, and I do get a little ornery about this because that's our mission statement, right? Poetry from the Pacific, not Cincinnati, Ohio. So that's the positive way, is sometimes you'll send to someone for whom this really works for any manner of reason. Sometimes it might just not fit what they're trying to do that day. On the cynical side, poetry, prose, fiction is fashion like anything, right? So you may write something that just happens to be fashionable and everybody wants to gobble it up. You might write something that's lyrical and poetic, and that this is not the year for lyrical and poetic clothing, right? So I would say aim for what you think is working, right? I mean, consult your teachers and your colleagues and everything. But if you have that weird thought in your head, like, I think this is actually better, but I'm not having success with it, then keep sending it out. You just need to find the right reader, right? Jean.
I loved your metaphor about craft, boats on the ocean. See, we're both trained as poets, but I'm a poet writing fiction now too.
Uh-huh.
So going back to what obviously each genre has its own forms, and you build your craft differently. And if you're writing a novel, you're building a big aircraft carrier as opposed to a canoe, right? But what would you say? But there's got to be crossovers, right? There's certain things, and a lot of things I have an opinion about it. But give me out of your talk the things that apply to poetry and to fiction.
Okay.
If I'm a writer, I pay attention.
Yeah, you do all those sort of introductory things. Yeah, and I'm a poet, but I write in prose, so that's also kind of an interesting and awkward position to be in. And there are a lot of crossovers, I think, between fiction and poetry, especially in certain kinds of fiction that are more lyrical, more about feeling spirit than just about plot. But I would say, in terms of form, I think in prose you can actually use any poetic form you want if you just consider that as a focal point, right? So, a nature poem, you sit under a tree, right? That sort of thing, so that you're not actually using the rules, but you're using that particular vantage point. So I would say there's a crossover there in terms of what vantage points you use, but also just the basic stuff like sentences. There are sentences in poems and there are sentences in novels, and you want to really work on sentences. Now, sentences are narratives unless you cut them up, right? So a sentence is a story, a sentence is an argument, and that's why in poetry they're wonderful when someone uses them to the reverse effect. Like John Ashbery writes sentences that are like, whoa, where did that go? But even that is, the effect is because he's still writing a normative sentence, right? Also just, you know, sitting a lot with your work. I write these index card poems because I don't have a whole lot of time. That's part of the reason. I got kids, I got work, I got this, I got that. So I can do one of these in an hour, let's say, when it's working. Otherwise, I just quit. If you're a novelist, you sit more, I imagine, right? So it's that quality of not just attending to the world, but attending to your posterior and your, you know, your work, right? I'm probably missing something crucial here, but I'll just leave it at that. Yes.
So when you say if a family member says, leave me out, you totally cater to that, or if you really feel like it's important to the book, memoir, whatever, is it okay to go ahead and put them in anyway?
Well, I've never had that experience myself.
Okay.
My mother was 5,000 miles away. She had dementia. I was writing about her. I was publishing about her. She didn't know. And the books that were being published were not exactly selling like Simon & Schuster. You know, it's small press, right? It's a small audience. So in that sense, it was a real luxury to not worry. But my friends who are local writers in Hawaii, I think some of them, I think my friend Gary is very, you know, he realizes Uncle will sue me or whatever. So I'll look for other characters. I mean, it's an individual choice, right? Either you're someone who's very loyal to family or you're not. I mean, if you really want to piss your family off, then by all means, write the bad stuff about them. But otherwise, it's probably a balancing act. And I know people have asked me, you know, what would your mother have thought if you're writing about her in her dementia? And I just say, well, she would have hated it. She would have absolutely hated it. But she was very insistent on giving her body to science because she wanted to be useful. And so this may be my rationalization, but I'm like giving her story to the larger community of people with family members with dementia. And that will be something useful. Yes?
So I was interested in what you said about starting your own publishing company.
Mm-hmm.
What's the first step?
Now you probably can Google how to start a small press. When I was doing it, there was no Google. Well, what I did was I thought, I'm going to start this thing. And that was back when you had email listservs, and you'd write an email and it would go out to 300 people. So one day I just sat down and wrote, I am starting this journal called Tin Fish. That's another story. And, you know, please send me your work if you are in the Pacific, right? Little did I know that people would actually send me stuff. I was so naive. I had no idea what I was doing. And I actually recommend that as a starting point, is just do it.
Just call for submissions.
Just call for submissions, and then you got to do it. One thing is, if you think this is going to be at all long term, is do the nonprofit status early rather than late. I made my press a nonprofit several years in, and the combination of my horrible record keeping and the fact that it had gotten more difficult at that point to become a nonprofit meant that I had to get a lawyer, and even she had a hard time with it for a while. So I would encourage you to do nonprofit, because then people will give you money, and if you sell things, you don't have to pay taxes.